Good morning. Thank you for having me, and thank you very much to Jill and Harry for inviting me to come and speak to everyone. I'm George Oates. I've been a software designer for about 20 years now, or just over 20 years. And since about 2008, I've been working in the cultural heritage sector. I'd like to share some ideas with you today around collections, audience, and contemporary practice, and also share some of my past work that might be of interest in these areas. So, to begin. Just about all of our old, venerable institutions contain collections gathered by collectors. These catalogues written by random collectors are non-standard. There are often intense and beautiful variegation, heterogeneity, and linguistic dynamics at play, and even hieroglyphics in some cases. One example of a collector collecting is Sir Hans Sloane, a prominent London figure and early physician who lived from 1660 to 1753 and actually lived in the building where my office used to be in London, in Bloomsbury. This is a page from one of his hundreds of catalogues, now housed at the British Library. And this is a 50-page essay that analyses and describes and reconstructs a best guess at how, when and why he and his staff catalogued the way they did. This is one of his book catalogues. Interestingly, in the early days of his collecting, it seemed as if he was working to collect a whole medical bibliography, and his catalogues were more about acquisition price than anything about the books in particular. Another great essay on book collectors comes from Walter Benjamin, the noted German philosopher and an eclectic thinker. Unpacking My Library is a story about how collections come about and how collectors themselves may not be the most rigorous of cataloguers, as you can see here, when he says, "For what else is this collection but a disorder to which habit has accommodated itself to such an extent that it can appear as order?" I'm wondering if a lot of our woes are governed by the fact that lots of our older collections are themselves made up of collections that were collected by collectors, each with their own motivations, areas of interest, and language of description. Given this incredibly diverse set of resources, over the years, many standards have emerged to try to corral the way people describe things into a small set of fixed categories. Some of this work is only done once and never looked at again. This work was often done with paper and pen, or a typewriter, or a punch card, or often these days on a lumbering piece of software that's poorly designed and stuck on top of a legacy database. These various constraints and challenges have resulted in cataloguers and other humans making a ton of workarounds to make their data the way they want it. This is a diagram made in 2010 to encapsulate the various data standards out there in the world of metadata. I wonder what that would look like today. Even back then, it looked pretty variegated. Lots of standards to choose from, as they say. This is, of course, the linked open data cloud. And how many of you have a blob in that cloud? A few, 10, something like that. This was a snapshot taken about 6 months ago, and here's a snapshot from yesterday, just so you can see. Some metadata has not made it into the linked open data cloud, however, like this handy note discovered at random in the bowels of the Wellcome Collection art store in London. In this box, folder numbers beginning with a 7 are numbered with video disc frame numbers. To find the catalogue number, look up the 7... number in the catalogue. Don't enter the final I. Then look there for the catalogue number, probably beginning with a numeral 2. Damn humans. Now I'd like to jump forward to today, where collectors describe their online collections as they're created, using predefined web-native data structures that are often already connected to authoritative data resources, like geolocation, for example, or something as simple as a standard date format. I'm equating someone who uses Pinterest or Flickr or Instagram as a cataloguer here. I realise this might be a bit contentious, but it's only to start drawing a line between the legacy and the contemporary. There's also loads of metadata generated automatically in the creation of a born digital resource, which doesn't go to waste, like EXIF data about photographs taken with a digital camera stored natively on Flickr. The other point to make about these contemporary web-native systems is that they live in a permissions space for creativity, innovation, and free expression. There are billions of us using the web now and happily uploading our digital materials, describing them in varying levels of details in languages from across the globe into databases made by all kinds of companies, some scarier than others. But that's for another talk. Actor/collectors organise things however they see fit, often with absolutely no need for consensus of any kind. Let me give you an example. The other day, my cousin James delivered my childhood Star Wars figures collection to me from Australia, where I grew up. Naturally, I set about arranging and rearranging the 80 or so figures into various classifications. And upon reflection, I realised I did this a lot as a child. Here is a pleasant arrangement by dominant colour. Here is a problematic one by kind. There are robots, humans, and other. I'd put this guy in the human section, but I wasn't 100% sure whether or not he was human. So I asked Twitter. Twitter was also unsure. Luckily, Wikipedia came to the rescue. Apparently there's some kind of being called a sentient. I suppose that's an other. We all have collections of some kind, whether it be Star Wars figures or owls or books. One of my favourite books about books is called The Library at Night by Alberto Manguel. I highly recommend reading it. He writes beautifully about the dynamism, order and mystery of books and libraries, and it might be of inspiration to you as you explore the world of linked data and its accompanying rationalism. He says, a library is not only a place of both order and chaos, it is also the realm of chance. Books, even after they've been given a shelf and a number, retain a mobility of their own. What I'd like to try and show is that our capacity to gather and reflect back this mobility is sadly lacking in most cultural metadata systems. It's concrete meets plastic. It's nobody's fault, but more that books or historical or art objects have so many entry points that can't possibly be captured by a single system. You might think that's a great reason to try to link together systems where we can, and maybe it is. But the links and structures are organic and dynamic and linguistic in nature, and that's something that's difficult for computers and frankly for us to keep up with. After, let's say, about 50 years or so of computer systems storing library metadata and other metadata that's culturally oriented, it's become dreadfully bloated. I think this is for three main reasons. That the original source metadata was often created in the context of a specific collection and therefore not especially conjoined or positioned in the aggregate. When the transposition from paper to computer happened, it squished a lot of the colour out of the catalogue's information. And because joyless tools and short time have meant that the richness of the material is never reflected particularly well in its metadata. This means that digitally, both search and aggregation can be vacant and unsatisfying. And later I'll show a little bit about this sparseness and how I've seen it and drawn it in various systems. So these born digital collections have internal integrity and are often designed for sharing and propagation. I'm using collection loosely here to mean things like all the photos on Flickr or all the pins on Pinterest or songs on Spotify. The service provider defines the data model and simply expects that everyone will use it. The interfaces are designed specifically for that system and its data, and the makers think deeply about what's being described and try to help users do a good general job. You also have this newish idea of tags, which arguably radicalized our ability to give flexible descriptions to things. Since, let's say, 2003 or so, we've seen an explosion in descriptive metadata all over the web, in endless languages from endless perspectives, and growing all the time. But they're also incredibly rigorous. Indeed, people might die if people don't use the standards. Have a look at what you can do with simple, comprehensive shared data. This is a map of all the planes flying around the planet in the air at once. It's driven by something called the Automatic Dependent Surveillance-Broadcast Standard. This is a surveillance technology in which an aircraft determines its position via satellite navigation and periodically broadcasts it, enabling it to be tracked. The information can be received by air traffic control ground stations as a replacement for secondary radar, blah, 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 blah. There are just 6 fields that the plane needs to broadcast. Call sign, altitude, heading, position, squawk number. Anyone know what a squawk number is? Nope, that's all right. And speed. And in response, the plane gets weather, terrain, information, and traffic. So with just 6 fields, this amazing map of all the planes moving live around the planet can be drawn. This is at planefinder.net, by the way, if you want a new screensaver. Perhaps it's the threat of imminent destruction or crashes or human death that's helpful for making something clear and short, like this data standard. So, and the final, probably the most important introductory point I'd like to make is about audience. One thing being a designer teaches you is how to figure out who you're doing the work for. Having an actual audience can help you stay focused. Are you getting them what they need? Do they enjoy using your stuff? Machines aren't exactly an audience. I mean, they're just big calculators. So who uses your catalogue? Talk to them. It might be the person sitting next to you at work. Perhaps I am a harvesting agent, and where harvesting agent might mean computer who absorbs your code and does something with it. I'd like to show you a few bits of work that I've made in the role of harvesting agent. And finally, and maybe the most importantly, and I realise now I actually gave a talk at EuropeanaTech in 2015, and in that talk I was trying to differentiate between making an impact versus demonstrating use. I think they're interestingly related but different challenges. So you do all this work to make your data attractive to machines. Do they like it? Do you know where it's being consumed? And I had a question for the audience actually. Do you yourselves consume data from other institutions? Yeah? Lots? Good? Great. And when I say consume, I wonder if that's aggregation or actually integration of that data. Some conversation over coffee. I guess the other question is, why do you want to link your data? And how will you know if you've done it well? So, I'd like to show you some of my previous work that I think bridges the gap between catalogue management and contemporary practice. So, back in the day, I was the first designer at Flickr, that big photo sharing website. It was great fun, and there are certain things we baked into its design that I wanted to make a note of with you. There's billions of photos, millions of people using this thing. So one of the key thrusts of the design was about participation. We made all the upload settings and so forth public by default, which was quite radical at the time because in 2003, 2004, you might have been using another photo sharing system, but you might have been using it in a vacuum because none of the photos were public. It was all sort of safeguarded, and a lot of the sort of language and design was about safety and, you know, a vault, stuff like that. So by making it public by default and knowing that not many people actually switch their software defaults, we suddenly had many more photos on show. And we thought very much about these things as social objects. So photos are good to look at, they're good to point at, they're good to annotate, they're good to talk about, and they're good to spread out and lay on a table. The publisher was often the photographer too. and anyone can add to the metadata given the right permissions. But at the time of uploading, the creator of the object was also encouraged to describe the work as she uploaded it. And for me, the most exciting part about that whole Web 2.0 thing that happened around the time that Flickr was coming online was that the system itself was rendering live data. Yes, it was social, and that's often claimed to be the most interesting part of Web 2.0, but the thing was alive, and people could see each other in it, and that was, and remains, really compelling. And I think another important point about Flickr's success was that sharing the content into other systems was baked in at day one. From the very first day, we made little interfaces that allowed you to send photos via email or post your photographs to your blog, upload via email, using all these existing sort of well-known publishing channels to get photos in and out of the system. And we added programmatic interfaces into Flickr pretty soon after we launched. The second main thing that I realised in hindsight that I was most interested in was classification. While the system did capture certain types of information about digital photographs, like the date it was taken, for example, we never impressed any kind of standard or rules on how people should describe their stuff. And yet, the photographs would grow into clusters that distinguish types of things based on their proximity to other concepts, like, for example, the tag piece. You can see just by the tags that people are using to describe their pictures, all these little blobs of structure just emerged. Incidentally, I had to pinch this screenshot from a book called Visual Information Communication, published in 2009, because they've killed the feature on the website, unfortunately. But all kinds of organic trends happened, and I wanted to give you a little example. So this is a photograph taken in Paris in March 2006, when there was some rioting going on. Here's the list of tags added to this photo, and these were the photographer's tags, more or less. But over time, as the photo grew in popularity, or interestingness, as we called it, the community added tags that had evolved to indicate popularity. Like, for example, top-F400 means that it's had more than 400 people favourite it. Incidentally, the photographer Hugh gave up his investment banking job to become a photojournalist because people really liked his pictures. So yeah, the other thing that I think happened quite naturally on Flickr, and we're very lucky for, is multilingual description. So just to give you an example of that, the full moon. I'm curious to hear more about your work in this area specifically, actually. So how many of your databases contain metadata that's actually been translated? So you contain 2 descriptions. Okay, awesome. Quite a few, maybe 10. Okay. That's a tricky one, isn't it? Of course, people wanted more structure than tags afforded, so I think it was in about 2007 we invented this thing called machine tags, or implemented this thing called machine tags, which is basically folksonomy meets taxonomy. So you can tag stuff with things like taxonomic data. In 2008, I launched a program called Flickr Commons, and our initial partner was the Library of Congress, which was amazing. Library of Congress had their photographs online, freely available for about 10 years before the Commons, all with sort of no known copyright restrictions, free to access, but they were interested to find a Web 2.0 partner to have more people look at more of their photos, so they came to Flickr. This is the homepage. It turned 10 years old this year, which is great. I think it's still going strong, and there's millions of pictures with no known copyright restrictions. I think it may be about 110 institutions participating, but I've lost track of that number now, actually. And there's examples all over the Commons of normal humans out there contributing real information to those photographs. I thought I'd find one at semi-random because we're on a steamship. It's from the National Library of Ireland, or one of the institutions that's done an especially good job of appealing to all the sleuths out there on the web. This photo was uploaded by the National Library of Ireland about 2 weeks ago, And since then, it's had 4,300 views, 54 faves, and 17 comments, including stuff like this. When the ship was built, who the captain was, when he was captain of the ship, where the boat was where the ship was when the photograph was taken, and they even found the captain in a census. And all of those facts in the comments and the photos reference various original documents and so forth. So Flickr Commons is still amazing because we have passionate cataloguers with a lot of time to give and really specific areas of interest. We have real new information being gathered, and so these social objects are being given more than one point of entry. And I think that's so important in a digital context. And most gratifying to me is that information collected on the Commons is actually being re-ingested back into official catalogues. And that was sort of the whole point. So that's really great. I was lucky enough to see Macbeth the other night in London with my friend Jill, and I was struck by this little passage by Macbeth. I'll admit he was assessing a murderer at the time, but you sort of get the idea. As hounds and greyhounds, mongrels, spaniels, curs, shows, water rugs and demi-wools are clept, all by the name of dogs. The valued file distinguishes the swift, the slow, the subtle, the housekeeper, the hunter, every one according to the gift which bounteous nature hath in him closed, whereby he does receive particular addition from the bill that writes them all alike. So perhaps Flickr Commons fans and helpers have been able to recognise and record the myriad particular additions surrounding the photographs for the record. My next job was leading the Open Library program at Internet Archive in San Francisco. It was a non-profit founded in 1996 with the mission to provide universal access to all knowledge. I tried very hard to apply some of what I'd learned at Flickr to the design of the system, specifically showing participation and allowing free classification. So Open Library, for those who don't know, is like a wiki-editable library catalogue. Launched in 2007, and it's got well over 1 million free ebooks available to read now. It also gathered library records from a variety of sources, Library of Congress, Amazon, and any and all libraries that scanned a book through the Internet Archive's book scanning program. I think over about 50 professional sources, plus original records created by the users through the website itself. So as I said, it's a Wikipedia for books. 30 million plus records, absolutely rife with errors and inconsistencies, plus those original records made by humans in the system that was constrained thanks to a user interface. And we also deployed Ferber in 2011, which is recognition of this idea of a work and all its additions. In addition to redesigning the user interface, I also worked to build tools that helped improve the internal consistency of the system. I'll give you an example of that in a moment. But also worked really hard to show the activity in the wiki, so you could start to see characters in it. George, who's interested in Mark Twain, for example. We allowed people to gather lists of books together, stuff that they like to read, or bibliographies they were collecting for an essay or something like that. We also made good use of bots who would move through the metadata and do little tiny weeny precise edits. And also the API into Open Library can now be hit with a whole bunch of different identifiers. So an ID from my system might actually return a hit in Open Library. But just to give you a little sense of the mess, these are all the representations of who we sometimes refer to as Mark Twain. There's 2 pages of them. Spirit is one of my favourites. So we built this user interface called Merge Author. So as you did a search for Mark Twain, in the facet results, it would show you all the variations of Mark Twain, and there'd be a little button in there that said, can you please help us fix this? And then you would gather up, you would choose what you thought was the primary name for this author, and then all the alternates weren't jettisoned, they were just collected up in a little extra field. So if you did want to search for Mark Twain Spirit, or Mark Twain, Mark, or Samuel Clemens, you could do that search, but you would retrieve Mark Twain. Just a couple of examples of bots. One was a script written by Bruce Washburn, who was at OCLC Research at the time. He updated millions of open library records to add OCLC numbers, just matching on ISBN, where we had them. We've also done the same thing with LibraryThing and Goodreads, 2 more social book sites. And now that all these IDs are interconnected, it opens up those new opportunities for other systems to interrogate Open Library using the IDs that they understand. Like this. My friend Ben made a bot that updated thousands of Open Library records with Goodreads IDs, matching those on ISBN as well. I realise ISBN isn't the be-all and end-all standard, and sometimes there are duplicates, etc., but it's not bad as a blunt tool. And for example, that let us do stuff easily like display Goodreads reviews on Open Library pages. So there's an example of a couple of older projects. Now I'd like to fast forward a few years and position myself as a harvesting agent. Just grab a quick drink. Thank you. So over the past 3 years or so, I've been developing a design practice I like to call spelunking, and that's an American word for exploring caves. I think our digital experience of cultural materials from libraries, archives and museums is massively search-centric, and that's actively inhibiting us from exploring things effectively. So a spelunker is a web-based thing. We make it good form and spectacle to explore existing individual data sets and structures quickly. It has no search and instead encourages you to click around following paths of interest to you. I'd like to show you 2 spelunkers that we've made. The first is Two-Way Street, and the second is our work with the Wellcome Library, both based in London. So Two-Way Street was made in 2015, independent of the British Museum. It operates on about 2 million records, RDF and SciDoc CRM. We built it with 3 people, and we built it in 1 week. And I'm sorry to say it's offline now because Amazon Web Services crapped out one day and deleted our database, and we just haven't had time to restore it. So I'm sorry that I have to give you screenshots and screenshots only. If anyone wants to sponsor the restoration of Two-Way Street, let me know. So this is the primary searching interface to examine the magnificent British Museum. And here are the instructions. To search across the whole database, just type a term into the main search box and click search. It's like, oh God, it's so boring. So I happened to find a little bit of metadata on the internet. So I downloaded the biggest file and I called a couple of mates. Like, okay guys, what are we going to do with this? And then we built a website. It's called Two-Way Street. You'll notice there is no search box on the homepage. The question I was exploring was, how can I represent these 2 million records without search? What does that force me to do? What are the contours of this collection? So let me explain a couple of the elements. So this element is sort of a map of acquisition history, and this is a map actually of the whole data set, 2.2 million records. You see every square there is shaded. It represents 1 decade of the institution's life, so 1753 to today. And the shading is based on how many objects were acquired in that decade. So, newsflash, the biggest acquisition decade was actually the 1980s for the British Museum, namely an enormous currency collection from a UK government department. But you can filter this visualization. So this second chart is filtered to show us only the acquisition pattern for about 1,000 things from the Venetian school. Or this filtered by classical deity shows us about 85,000 objects by acquisition year, and interestingly seems a fairly consistent subject. We also filter each page or each list to show who the things were acquired from. And in the case of the British Museum, that's developed into a personal research interest of mine, because there's a whole lot of stories in here about interesting little societies in London who funded various trips to various places and brought lots of things back to London. So that's well worth exploring. But you can click on any of these things. You can click on a single decade, you can click on a person or an organisation. These are all the facets in the data. And you'll notice there's actually a subtle visualization in here as well. The darker names mean that there is a value in those fields mostly. So made of or type of thing are regularly recorded. But if I click on, let's say, where the thing was found, then basically I'm just looking at a visual ordered list. That's all this is, really. And we didn't alter the data at all, so sometimes you see glitches or don't knows, which I really like. And these lists, they really just show you facets of whatever you're looking at or attracted to. There's nothing radical about this necessarily, apart from you can see pictures a lot. But really it's just a faceted list of stuff for all of these pages. So when you get to a type of thing, for example, printed things, you see the acquisition graph at the top and the people who the objects were acquired from. They're scoped to the thing that you're looking at. So you can see the acquisition history of printed things. And also the sub-facets are illustrated. So, for example, you can see that about 1/5 of the printed things are postcards. Again, you can just click on everything. There are printed scarves at the British Museum. This is the display underneath the object, so it's showing you all the metadata that we have and everything's linked. So you can click on everything like who the scarf came from, in this case Christopher J. Spring, and then all of a sudden you're looking at all the stuff that he brought to the museum, most of which appear to be cotton woven, and lots of them came in 2002. Lots of beautiful scarves. There are all kinds of things at the British Museum, including these Bulgarian knitted socks, which I'm sure hipsters would enjoy. But when you think of British Museum, I don't think Bulgarian knitted socks necessarily leaps to mind. I certainly didn't know they had any. Again, you can just jump around in the facets, see all the socks they have. They have a lot of socks. They also have lots and lots of knitted things, etc. But one thing we did on Two-Way Street, which I liked, was we were also explicit about the things that we didn't know. So for any one object, we'd also show the facets that we didn't have a value for. And again, you could click on any of those to keep exploring. So if you decided at that time you were interested in Painter, you could just click on Painter and keep going. So as a harvesting agent, I wanted to let you know what it was like to work with this data. So it turns out the British Museum SciDoc CRM RDF hairball was really hard to consume because it was so big. And then once we'd actually downloaded it and sort of looked at it, it was even harder to traverse. It was a huge file and an ontological maze. For the uninitiated, basically impossible. You had to talk to the human who wrote it, and even then it took a long time to explain things. So we managed to find this secret little field in the massive ball of RDF that just contained, I think it was something like fields for display, and we squished that down into just an array of key value pairs and made it JSON, and then shoved it all into Elasticsearch and used that like a data store. And we also built machine consumable pages. It looked a bit like this. That was really good for Googleness. And we also, of course, link back to the original data source. So if people wanted to go and chomp on the RDF, they are welcome to do that. And in the spirit of goals needing metrics, we also put some basic analysis on it. And, Two-Way Street for something that we didn't even do any marketing for and now is offline. It wasn't bad coverage. And in fact, we used to get emails from people with sort of queries about coins and stuff, and I was like, please talk to the British Museum. The second project was for the Wellcome Library. It was made in 2016, and it was exploration leading to an alpha.wellcomelibrary.org project. We were moving around about 1 million records written in Mark, Again, the team was really small, just 3 people, and it was 4 one-week sprints. There was a whole bunch of other external data sources that we tried to hook into, like medical subject headings, VIAF, Library of Congress subject headings, etc. This is the basic project breakdown. The first week was about, I'll just get straight into it. Week 1 was about, okay, what sort of metadata do we have? And what kind of completeness do we have? Is it good metadata? Is it thin? Is it weak? So this is another visualization of those 1 million records that shows you for every possible mark field in the data, I think there are about 180 total, how many times is there a value in that field? So the darker squares there show you that those fields were used a lot. We also made an explorer view of that, so you could actually start to sort of surf around in the mark data and see which ones of the fields had values consistently or not. So if I sort this list, I find out that only about 4 fields were used 100% of the time, and they're kind of nerdy fields, which is fine. B number is the welcome specific ID, by the way. You could again click on everything. So this is a single mark field. The visualization is all interactive, so you can click through and you can see the sort of spread within the fields. And then we drew pictures like this, which are a row for every record. And you can see we're just repeating that same map, but for every single record. So if you click through a specific value, like personal name in this case, you see a row for every record and a little stamp to see which fields have a value. And there you can see the little differences in the style or coverage of the metadata. And the cataloguers had never actually seen an aggregate view like this before, and we wondered if we might eventually be able to spot individual humans based on the fields that they like particularly. Some catalogers are very hot on certain mark fields, which I find very interesting. But just to give you a sense of that dynamic, this is a field called 1 lowercase v volume, 1 uppercase v volume. So you can sort of see how the different fields are used, which is interesting. There's also a bunch of grubby stuff, which I think is pretty normal now in my experience. This is Does it include summaries in English? Yep, it's in English. Pretty sure it's in English. Anyway. Week 2 was beginning to visualize things, just drawing the data a lot so people could sort of see stuff and move around in it. So this is a map of subjects over time. And you can see the little white tips show the proportion of digitized materials. There's a big peak in there because they have a lot of books from the 1800s. But similarly, we just tried to visualize and draw as much about the actual metadata as we could, showing the thing. So again, just like we did on Two-Way Street, all of the kind of entity pages were scoped. So you could see in 1893, they happened to be writing a lot about eyes, or at least the collection contains lots of books about eyes. So you can jump in and see a book about eyes. We also link back to the week 1 record view, where again, everything's linked. And we linked to the super awesome welcome implementation of a AAAF viewer, which you may have learned a bit about yesterday or hear more about later. So you can look at really zoomed in views of gross eye diseases if you want. And you really can't beat an ordered list, so we just made loads of those. Week 3, we decided to go in the very opposite direction. This is a printmaker called James Gilray. He was an English caricaturist and printmaker famous for his etched political and social satires, mainly around the 1800s. He used to draw things like this. That's gout, by the way. So we challenged ourselves to make a hand-cranked and informative page about him and link to as many things as we could, whether at Welcome or elsewhere. So I just kind of wanted to show you the page real quick. Excuse me. Gross. So we did this working with the metadata, like the subjects that were also already associated with his materials, but also working with a curator and a writer at Wellcome. So a friend of mine said, this feels like I'm walking around a museum. At first I thought it was just going to be a list of stuff until I saw the editorial. And he said, this feels a bit new. But of course, being slightly nerdy, we also collected a whole bunch of IDs for James Gilray from around the web. But this was the essential dynamic that we were exploring. And it's sort of, I think it's to do with the Macbeth quote that I made before, where, you know, most institutions know the 2% or so of materials that they have that people come to and recognise and appreciate. So they spend a lot of time creating resources around those 2% or so of things. But then there's all this other stuff that they don't know much about, and that the vast tracts of quite bad metadata doesn't particularly help explain or expose. So yeah, there was the week 4 was anyway sort of trying to bring those two ideas together. This huge James Gilray page that took us a week to make, and all the other pages of all the other entities in the system. So I'll flip through this really quick. I'm conscious of time now. So we just made this Alpha Explorer, which I think is still online. We connected VIAF and Wikipedia to enhance our people entities. It was immediately obvious that most of the catalogue's full of old white guys. But yeah, these pages were suddenly rich and nice. Again, we're just showing all the data. Ordered lists, so these same kind of techniques. Very simple to use. Subject trends. Also with subjects, we did this nice little thing which says microbiology is often seen with these other subjects, but if you want to go a bit deeper, you can go a bit deeper using these subjects. So yeah, just no search again, just lots of things to click on. So, to bring it to a conclusion, I sort of wanted to end with a challenge for you. What can we learn from the practices of web-native systems, these big content machines of the world that aren't cultural institutions? They're born digital, there are active participants in them, there's live data, and the data structure's kind of baked in. Like, if you could think about the system you have and apply these kinds of things to it, how might that change it? Or weaken it, or make it better? For example, one of my favourite really new systems is called If This Then That. Has anyone heard of this? Yeah, it's really cool. It's just a web service that relies purely on events and transactions. That's all it really does. It says, if something happens in this system, make something else happen in this system. Like, how could you apply something that's so live and specific to a cultural data set? How can we avoid these copying errors and bloat around? There's a lot of aggregation going on, but the metadata is still thin. And I know a lot of your work is making that metadata better, and I can't wait to hear how you're doing that. But we're still passing around these big error-filled blobs of stuff, like this. I mean, this is one of the fields I found in the welcome mark. I mean, does this really need to be passed around on the internet? Does this really need to be in the linked Open Data Cloud? There were some IDs in there that people had forgotten what they were for, but they were keeping them around just in case, kind of thing, you know? I know that's what we do, but... and I was surprised actually to enjoy reading a report from OCLC on mark tag usage. So this is the sort of top 10 fields used, and look how quickly those numbers drop off, just in terms of consistency and use of fields. But could you do a similar analysis on your metadata to sort of see what kind of strength or weakness or completeness there is in your data? Similarly, you know, what if you could only publish 5 fields from your data set? Could you jettison some of it or most of it, at least for use by another party? You know, how complete is your data? Is it thin in places? Could you just chop them out to transport it? Remember that the plane map? It's just 6 fields that allow you to draw that stuff, just 6. You know, is there a minimum viable record? What's the smallest version of your metadata that you could pass around? This was one of my this is one of my favourite things I found in the linked Open Data Cloud. It's the Folding Chair Club. You bet this chap didn't have to download or adopt any library standards to join the cloud. But the club is you get a folding chair and you come to the weekly meetings, you bring someone else and something to drink. There is no restriction. I just love this club. I sort of want to start one in London. Does anyone recognise this thing? Yes! It's called the Commodore Dataset, and I had one of these when I was growing up. It allowed me to play Winter Olympics on the Commodore 64. Yeah, it's a Commodore dataset, and it was a tape drive for my very first computer. But it's also a really cool little tool that I suggest you have a look at, not necessarily to implement yourselves, but just to reference and learn from. It's called Dataset. It's written by Simon Willison, and it's a new tool for creating and publishing JSON APIs for SQL-Lite databases. And just in terms of contemporary practice, I think Simon's approach to creating a little tool that lets you publish the CSV and make it into a handy little API that draws web pages that you can query with SQL, etc., it's just I think it's something to have a look at and maybe emulate. And just in terms of activity, I think it's only 6 months old or so, but there's lots of people operating on it. So I'm looking forward to hearing your strategies about passing data around and how successful you've been in catching and parsing, having others catch and parse yours. And here's a vote for CSV. It's really cool and easy to use. What tiny updates can you make to your catalogue? Maybe don't start with sector-wide, but maybe think about your collection and what you can do to improve it. And I think I'll end on this note, that making available is really different to actively connecting to other systems. So have a think about the difference between those two statements. Just putting all your millions of records out onto the internet isn't actually the same as having them being used by people. So thanks very much. Thanks for your time. Look forward to meeting you. Thank you.